Hello there, it's Chris again, and this is another Kitchen Table Teachings. This time we're talking about the competency outcomes continuum. It's a continuation from the last chat we had, where we talked about the differences between competencies and outcomes, and learning outcomes and learning objectives. What we're leading up to is the choice that you have to make in the next week about the approach you want to use to curriculum design. So there's two basic approaches that we're suggesting at Vancouver College in the PIDP. The one is the competency-based approach, and the other is the outcomes-based approach. So let's start talking a little bit about that, and hopefully we'll clarify things a bit for you so you can make a decision. On the slide in front of you, you see something entitled the Competency Outcomes Continuum. And it is a continuum in the sense that it does go from one extreme to the other, in a sense. Remember the last time I showed you that slide with the graph on it. On the left-hand bottom, we had the competency-based area, and the right-hand top, we had the outcomes-based area. And the graph basically talked about the difference between novices to advanced learners and increasing levels of complexity. So if we look at this, we can see on the left-hand side, competency development has to do with developing individual discrete competencies in class and assessed in class. It's best with procedures or processes. And some examples that you see there are nursing, immunizations, giving immunizations. For example, we maybe start with injecting tangerines or oranges, so we get the process of immunizing down, and eventually we get up to immunizing humans. But the assessment's done in class. It's a step-by-step thing. The nurses generally are beginners, they're novices. They're learning a new set of processes, a new set of perhaps even psychomotor skills. Another example would be carpentry. Use of tools, for example, where you're teaching people who don't know anything about tools to use tools. So that's the competency development area on the one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, we have outcomes development. Now, outcomes, as we've talked about in the last kitchen table teachings, are unpredictable. They're messy. They're divergent. They're integrative. They synthesize competencies together. They try to simulate complex real-world performances. Now, examples of these are critical incident commanders. These are people who respond to hazmat spills or plane crashes, any number of things like that. They have to be able to put together, integrate, and synthesize a number of complex competencies in real time. Mediators, psychologists, those sorts of things. So that's the competency outcomes continuum. What you should be thinking about is, with your course, what is it that you want to teach these people? What do you want them to learn and do? Are they novice learners? Are they advanced learners? Are you looking at developing competencies, or are you looking at integrating competencies? So the choice depends, as it says here, on who your learner is, what knowledge, skill, and attitude he or she brings to the course, the level of the course, as far as novice to advanced goes, the placement of the course in a larger program, types of assessment to be used, and on and on. It's context, context, context. So for example, a group of 10-year-olds build a birdhouse at the rec center on a Saturday. That could be an outcomes-based course because of the context that the kids are building it in. The outcome is the built birdhouse. The next example there is if you're looking at building a birdhouse as part of a one-year carpentry course, you could see that might be a competency-based approach, because that's just one of many competencies that are being worked on discretely over the course of a year. So context is the word that you have to use. What is the context of your course? What are the learners? Where are they in their continuum? Where are they as far as their ability to do things? What are their prerequisites, for example? Okay, so let's take a look. Competency-based versus outcomes-based curriculum design. If you're looking at competency-based, you're going to be using a DACUM, which is a fancy word, an acronym for Design a Curriculum. It's another term for it is a course profile. On this, you have goals, objectives, and these become performance objectives, which is a topic for another kitchen table teaching in the future. if you're choosing the competency-based approach, you have to develop a DACM, a course profile, and you have to come up with some performance objectives. The assessments are done in class setting. There's criteria and conditions that are added to them, and we'll talk more about that later. Demonstrations, tests are a couple of examples of that. It's a left to right kind of development. You either start with the goals or you start with the objectives and build towards the goals when you're building your profile. That's the competency-based approach, and in a nutshell. Outcomes-based, you have an outcomes guide and an outcomes map that you have to develop. This is a backwards approach. So we start on the other side, on the right-hand side, and we look at, okay, what's the real-world performance that we're simulating, that we want these students to be able to move towards by the end of the course. So then we move from the right to the left. What are the course outcomes that we should develop? In other words, what do the students have to learn in the course to prepare them for that real-world performance? And that real-world performance, don't forget, is a complex, integrated, synthesized set of competencies. It's a messy kind of a world out there, and we want to prepare people to be able to do that. So that's the outcomes-based approach. Once we look at the outcomes and we get those from the real-world performances, then we immediately say, all right, how should we assess that? What's an authentic way to assess that? It's not just in-class tests and quizzes and demonstrations that are trying to measure the development of, say, a single competency. What sorts of things can we do to capture in a dynamic way, in a continuous kind of way, people's progress towards those real-world performances? So we're looking at things like portfolios, for example, also placements out in the real world, those sorts of assessments. We also want to emphasize the role of the student in assessment, so journals, self-reflection, those sorts of things. From there, so there's an example of assessments based on the real-world outcomes, portfolios, journals, job placements, that sort of stuff. After we look at the assessments, then we have these two columns. We have concepts and issues and skills. So these are things that we want to, from which we build the stuff of the course or the workshop. In other words, lesson plans. What concepts are important to be taught? What are the issues, the dilemmas? What sort of things go on in the real world that we have to have these students wrestle with so they become able to do that real world job? And as well, what are the skills? So it's not, outcomes-based doesn't kind of toss the skills out, doesn't toss those competencies out. We're just taking a person from a certain level and adding more skills together so that they can actually put it all together into that real-world performance. Lastly, in the outcomes-based approach, we're looking at making sure we have the right students in the course. So prerequisites are required, whereas the competency-based approach, we're usually taking novice people right from the beginning. They don't know anything. We're bringing them in and developing those competencies. So you can see that the outcomes-based approach goes from right to left. So those are the two different approaches that we're suggesting you want to choose from in developing your course. Competency-based, which goes from beginning with goals, working towards objectives, or you can start with objectives and stick them together into a series of progressions so that you achieve a goal. Or the outcomes-based, which is basically looking at the real-world performance and working backwards from that into the course. Okay, here's what a DACM looks like. The triangles on the left-hand side there are the goals. So you'd have goal A. These rectangles are your objectives, and this is a linear way of organizing your content. You can also change this, as we'll learn later on when we're looking at scheduling. You can take those rectangles and move them around, so when you actually teach the course, the how of the course, you can move the objectives around in different ways. This is a way of organizing the what right now. So goal A leads to is developed. Then we have objective A1, A2, A3. Those three objectives, if we're assuming that that's all we're working on, once a person gets to that A3 objective, then they've achieved goal A, and so on for B and C and D. So this is the what, again, of the curriculum. And we're looking at, remember the last video, or the second last video, we talked about performances, all those active verbs. This is where you stick those verbs in. So if the goal is to build a birdhouse, we have, for example, saw the wood, measure the so-and-so, do all these different performances. At the end of it, then they got the birdhouse built. So that's the competency document that you're going to be working on if you choose competency-based. For each of these objectives, you will then be developing up to 10. 10 is the maximum for the assignment. Performance objectives, and we'll talk about that in another kitchen table teaching. But basically, just to foreshadow it, you start with the performance. So the student will build a birdhouse, and you add conditions. So in a shop, given a set of tools, conditions, the student will be able to build a birdhouse according to the specifications in the manual. According to the specifications in the manual, that's the criteria, the standards. And you can see that helps you when you're assessing that student as well. But that's for another day. We'll get into that a bit more. Let's go on to outcomes. This is the outcomes guide form. If you choose the outcomes-based approach, you will be filling out one of these things. You notice it starts over there on the right-hand side, course outcomes. And even further on the right-hand side, it's not there, of course, but you're considering the real-world performances. And then you consider, okay, what does this student have to do or know or have an attitude about or a value in the course in order to meet those real-world outcomes. Then the next step is to develop the assessment, the authentic assessment, strategies to try to capture that. Then you deal with skills, concepts, and issues, and prerequisites, and you have your outcomes guide built. From there, you're going to be developing a map, and that's a topic for later on. But basically, it's very, very simply, a map is a way of navigating from the beginning to the end of the course. So you can add in that map the prerequisites, and then, for example, we'll deal with concepts A, B, C, issues C, D, E, F, skills 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a certain pattern, in a certain way. And so you can creatively develop a map or a guide that will help that student go through, navigate through that course. Okay, so in a nutshell, left-hand side, when you're making that decision this week, after looking at all the videos and taking a look at all the readings and so on, you're going to be choosing competency-based CBE education. If the content is learned step by step, students are unfamiliar with the content, in other words, they're beginners. The course is introductory, processes and procedures are being emphasized. Students are assessed in the class setting on those competencies, and the focus is on developing competencies or discrete skills or pieces of knowledge or attitudes by the end of the course. That's CBE. That's for you. If you're in that kind of a context with your learners and what you want to do, choose CBE, and you'll develop your course profile, DACM, and your performance objectives. Now, on the other hand, choose OBE. If students need to get the big picture, if they're integrating previous knowledge, if authentic assessment is being used, and by authentic assessment, we're talking about things that try to capture the more dynamic nature of the real-world performance. So things like portfolios, video portfolios, for example, is a good example. Ongoing student reflection on how they're doing, placements in the real world, those sorts of things. If the students are beginning at advanced levels and they have skills and competencies developed, and you're integrating things together, the content is complex, it's kind of messy, there's a number of different ways to get to the end points. And if students are expected to integrate things together to come up with a sort of a fluid, integrated, real-world performance, then you're talking outcomes-based or OBE education. Okay, so that's something for you to reflect on this week and talk about in your base groups, and talk about back and forth with me. And let me know if you have any questions or concerns, as usual. Thank you for keeping current in keeping up with your readings and your activities and your postings and sharings. I know it seems sometimes a bit stilted when you're doing an online course in a way, because here you go, you send something out, a posting, and then, oh, you know, it might be a day or 2 days or whatever before you get a response. So it's not exactly like having a conversation in class. And I know that can be a little bit hard to deal with for students who are used to face-to-face classes. But please hang in there and keep posting back and forth and discussing things, challenging each other. Challenge me, challenge the things that I say. I'm happy to get involved in the discussion and the debate. That's all for now. Thanks very much, and I'll talk to you again soon.